Okay, starting.
Yes.
Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye Nidra Namda Rapsarave Jamgön Kongtrül Nije Tugra Levonze Da Sibe Chödrak Mare Mentam Dunge Chezeve Rosoy Konda Puje Tarze Ina Chödrak Yongden Song Chödrak Chödrak Nyelong Leje Chawan Chen Mare Mensre Dunge Nyugu Chenye Chönze Rachenam Dene Tajin Saju Yuden Luzo Tuyu Ko Chungrai Chodong Kyunyi Jente Dalu Mensen Jambe Yong Lai Du Zedene Cheche Chenra Avesre Che Dalu Temu Menpa Ravsre Ne Kadang tenju zhongloi tokpa ye Lodrö Pobe nuwa zaldu solo Tongpo nga ye da la xin juru jen Da gen de ye ngo la chak je pa So chen chun dar rong me pa ye Ro la nyi jere juru kwan te la du Jamgön Shana Dorje Jinreze Sayin Bo Drbanam Brasare Namgen Bo Shamba Kunduzon Yeve Sejin Jela Shaje Wo Sheje Kala Chenrav Chengurje Zebe Don Durje Len Lapo Jarve Dan Bakune Sanzepe Gajurum Bo Shala Shaje Wo Serap Kundu Sije Tanyele Tamge Samye Shagi Yong Shen Chongju Minbe Lamken Karma Pa Meshe Tebe Chiwe Tsuge Du Lazo Tene Che Namba Chu Sinkin Tso Dagwa Shudi Etere Samba Shongchup Chodu Sem Jepa Sal Tamne Chuljindu Senro Nang.
So please begin by generating the superior mindset called the body mind.
Ti yin tu ta kazan ban la tong ge ju de xie yong tu ji bu tan ba ni da chek mang de te ba za li tan ni chu li jin du yi la xie ju sum xu ba de.
So yesterday, in terms of the prerequisites for Vipassana, it was explained that the author, Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye, lists 3 prerequisites necessary for a practitioner who wants to do Vipassana meditation. The first of the 3 is to rely on a wise teacher. The second is to spare no effort in listening extensively. And the third is to reflect accordingly.
Ta ti sum ge na ne tong bo ni de shu tsar ne ni ba xie yin ba ka sum ba de xie yin ba ka yin.
And the 2 first of these 3 prerequisites were explained yesterday. Today we'll go on with the explanations of the third, which is to reflect according to the material one has studied, the material that has been explained by a master who has full knowledge of the meaning of the teachings.
Ta ti yin de nga la chul yin du sam ba chul se de
Ting pungig meditator.
Chul-yin senpa-wo song-do. Chul-yin-du se-du. Chul se-du. Pen-na tawa number takwa-chi. Tawa number takwa-chi la-sama-tang-kore ma-to. Tawa number-chi me-na la-tong-ke-tokpa-ti rang-ju-tu-je-tu-we-tu-cheg-ma-re song-de.
Now, the third prerequisite was about the practitioner reflecting accordingly, that is to say, according to the teachings he has listened to, explained by a master who has full knowledge of the meaning of those teachings. So, the word accordingly in the phrase to reflect accordingly refers to that the practitioner is expected to, on the basis of reflection, proper reflection, give rise to an authentic view in terms of what has been explained. An authentic view is a view not tainted by mistaken beliefs and the like. Hence, one may refer to it as authentic or perhaps pure, in that it's a viewpoint free from flaws in terms of what has been explained. The reason for an authentic view being necessary is that without the pure or authentic view, the view free from various flaws such as mistaken conclusions, beliefs and the like, if that is at hand, that becomes an obstacle in terms of practicing Vipassana meditation. In fact, without a flawless view, it's not possible for the practitioner to attain any level of realization of Vipassana or insight.
Ta tawa number thakpa sanke tiyang chungdön la zon ma dön beche ne nge betön la zo dön bachi gogre song.
Tömpa se du give shinin gi tenki.
Mare.
Ona.
Chungdön te la zor dön ne chungdön rang gelen gokor ma de beche. Gedön ki tawa te khako utum te ne tilla la dong ngo jong ye.
Now, in terms of so-called viewpoint in Buddhism, there are two perspectives listed. The so-called provisional meaning or perspective of a viewpoint and the so-called definitive or absolute perspective of the viewpoint in question. Now, in the context of Vipassana meditation, the practitioner should primarily, or the practitioner is to primarily rely on the second of these two perspectives, the definitive or absolute perspective. In that, the first perspective deals with provisional truth, as it were. It's about perspectives that serve a purpose, and once they've served their purpose, they are no longer needed, whereas the definitive or absolute perspective is about the actual nature of reality, which is not provisional. These two perspectives may prove confusing for some people. In fact, the two perspectives may give rise to confusion in terms of many practitioners. And it's one of the main points of debate among Buddhist scholars, how to define these two perspectives.
Jamgön
However, Khenpo Rinpoche will give or voice the explanations regarding definition and the like of these two perspectives according to the findings of Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye. So how he explained these two perspectives. So to begin with, one has to consider that there are three categories of teaching in terms of what Buddha Shakyamuni taught, named the teachings of the first turning of the wheel of the Dharma, the teachings of the second turning, and the teachings of the third turning of the wheel of the Dharma. And in terms of the first of these three, the primary subject taught by Shakyamuni, Buddha Shakyamuni, was that of the Four Noble Truths. And in terms of that exposition, the Buddha set forth 16 attributes as to the Four Noble Truths.
Yeah.
Each of the Four Noble Truths has four perspectives or attributes. And those teachings primarily concern practitioners of the Shravaka path. However, practitioners of all Buddhist divisions do study those teachings and contemplate their meaning and meditate upon them. It's just that in the Shravaka tradition, those teachings are the primary focus of practitioners of this tradition. It doesn't mean when one says these teachings were given primarily for that followers of that tradition, it doesn't mean that the other Buddhist traditions do not concern themselves with those teachings, not at all. It's just that those teachings are the main theme, as it were, in that tradition.
When the young and the Tondon, they don't say on the Nedon, Ketchum Shuji in the Tondon, the Ketchum Mare Segio.
So when Khenpo Rinpoche listed the names of these two perspectives, the provisional perspective and the definitive or absolute perspective, one should not draw the conclusion that the definitive or absolute perspective is of greater importance than the provisional one, not at all. A given practitioner needs to know both.
Tanda environment thinking in your trying to live there. Chetanji thinking Tonsiana. In the Chile thinking sort of shaggy or mare, Dilla thinking made a shupozo, Monsieur Zoya Gotene, Tensake, Nurging the Kangatorsitan here.
In fact, these two perspectives both are needed, as was said, and there is a relationship of interdependence between them. One is the basis for the other, and vice versa. So it's a pair where both perspectives are equally important. Now, if one doesn't understand this, then one makes a fundamental mistake, in the same way as in today's world, where economic prosperity in terms of some parts of our world is the norm. In some parts of the world, the majority of populations have economic prosperity. And the prosperity has been fueled by the sentiment of wanting even more economic prosperity, to the point where the Earth's resources have been misused. Fossil fuel and the like has been used for decades without a single member of the human race giving thought to whether that would perhaps not be the best of ideas if one overuses the natural resources in various ways of planet Earth. Today, this is evident because climate change has now happened. It's starting to happen and will get worse. And now it seems it's pretty much perhaps too late to reverse the destruction of our planet. Why did this happen? Well, because it was ignored by people that the natural resources available and how one uses them, there is a connection of interdependence between the two. If you overuse the natural resources, then that apparently pollutes the world and disturbs the natural order to the extent where one risks the planet being entirely destroyed. And this most individuals didn't think about at all until a couple of years back. But it's been going on for decades. Now, today, those who have gotten the point here try in many ways to make the majority of the world understand that it might be too late unless radical change is made now. It seems radical change won't happen because still the majority of human beings on this planet do not get the point. So that's an example of the relationship between the provisional meaning or perspective and the definitive meaning or perspective. Without a good knowledge of the provisional perspective, it's not possible for a practitioner to acquire a good comprehensive knowledge and realization of the definitive perspective.
Perna korbe rangin de dungalijin yimbachi mashena plagdung gamsing korayon yemero.
Now, a practitioner who has not realized fully that the affairs of the world are of the nature of suffering, that person could never attain any level of realization as to vipassana meditation. It's simply not possible.
단 되는 녀든 그따와 또 그래 송에 간송 되기 열으서나 따라도 감 퉁핀지기 공사 공과라 송비어와 정전도 조 맞대 녀든 또
in his work Jamgön Kongtrül says or stresses the importance of developing the authentic view. And this is a message for the practitioner who has gone through training in the provisional perspective and therefore is able to adopt a flawless view. That kind of practitioner can make progress on the path of vipassana meditation. That's all. So, in terms of the three turnings of the wheel of the Dharma, the teachings of the first turning are categorized as a provisional perspective.
Zuk pungpone songte number 30 chimbe yishig partu kanga rajin chi tongba yimbache tenla phapnong pse.
Then there is the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma, and here Buddha Shakyamuni went through each and every possible phenomenon, starting with physical form up to and through the omniscience of an enlightened individual, explaining with respect to each thing that in nature the phenomenon at hand is empty of a real reality.
Tene Chödrak ranjin tongbe tongni tenge den tartu yin songkente mangbu shirare.
And there are many who assert this teaching, the teaching that knowledge of emptiness, emptiness being synonymous with the absence of a real reality, that knowledge therefore being free of mental fabrications, that this is the definitive or absolute perspective.
Ti che de sabe durjate uma thumu re sungyor jamgön songna.
However, according to Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye, those of this view are primarily individuals of the Madhyamaka school of thought, one of the many Buddhist schools of thought. The school of thought which emphasizes the emptiness perspective as synonymous with absence of a real reality in terms of phenomena.
Tandi pana zo su zo den nang yor sana loben pablu tang Buddha palta Chandar Kirti khona be zo den nang ne sungyor
In terms of Buddhist masters of old, there are the three Indian Buddhist masters Nagarjuna, Buddhapalita and Chandrakirti,
Shantarachita,
as well as Shantarakshita, who adhered to this viewpoint, namely that this is the definitive or absolute perspective as to Buddha Shakyamuni's teaching. Of course, many more, in that all four masters, the ones listed, had many disciples who then spread this view by way of teaching it to their disciples and so on. In terms of today's Tibetan Buddhist schools, it is the Gelug school who upholds this view, namely that the teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni, today known as that the teachings of Buddha Shakyamuni in terms of the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma are the definitive or absolute perspective of the Buddha's doctrine.
Kollo tama de ngeden tartu re kollo barbate dondon tebe ngeden re
Lasso?
Kollo tangbol tena ko ngeden res kollo barbate kollo tama de tena dondon re de yores.
Now, according to other Tibetan Buddhist schools, the teachings of the third turning are or make for the absolute perspective, the definitive meaning as to Buddha Shakyamuni's doctrine. And those of this view explain that the teachings of the second turning can be categorized as definitive or absolute when compared to the teachings of or in relation to the teachings of the first turning. But when compared to the teachings of the third turning, the teachings of the second turning become provisional.
대간나 신게 별 따르 추주 나네 발든 사자반다고 질 차샤나 콜로 바르바든 예든 타투르 송게 망그리시라 망그리.
However, in the Sakya school of Tibetan Buddhism, the majority uphold the view that that the teachings of the second turning of the wheel of the Dharma are the definitive or absolute perspective of Buddha Shakyamuni's doctrine.
다 콜로 타망예들에 송진데 다 가지기 나네 감바롱 정도 진다고 감마 chödrak 야소다고
Sumpadan Chödrak yapso dympa.
덤바 시드 펜신 chöjing 종내다고
Sito pension Chögi jongne.
Jamgön Lodrö Thaye 된적게 콜로 타만든 예든 송비어.
Now, if we look at the Kagyu school, then the majority here see the teachings of the third turning as synonymous with the definitive or absolute perspective of Buddha Shakyamuni's doctrine. Examples are the third Karmapa Rangjung Dorje, the seventh Karmapa Chödrak, as well as Situ Pension Chöki Jungne and Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye.
Tene takana shinge jonang pagi chujun zamba mangchewe kolo taman ngedore songpyo.
And the majority of masters in the Jonang tradition of Tibetan Buddhism uphold that view as well.
Ta sache na ne yang ta yongra ge kepa gotu singi sache tsigiyo de kepa chukchi. Di na ne benjin shakji shoding ge sona ngedon tartu te kolo tamare songpyo.
Now, in the Sakya tradition, we saw that the majority take another view. However, there are some masters of this tradition who take the same view as the Kagyu and Jonang traditions. Now, in general, in the Sakya school, you have 6 masters of that school who are considered the greatest in terms of that tradition. One of these 6 is Shakya Chodron, and he takes the view that the teachings of the third turning are the absolute or definitive perspective of Buddha Shakyamuni's doctrine.
Tante kollo tamading yedon re songchin de nenga kabas yorsana. Flakton gambe kablas. Semje ranjing tongba imbate ngo tongba imbate ranjing ösal tike to gogyare.
Ram semgi ngovor yang mena ngovor tang ranshin I dönchik insarva ina.
Dönchik da re.
Tene?
Ngo tongbate ha kongkin de ranjing ösal kyo gogyare. Chezang ösal.
Now, in terms of what the crucial point is when asserting that the teachings of the third turning are the absolute or definitive perspective. Here, masters of this view point out that in the context of vipassana, insight of the true nature of reality, when an individual, to some degree or at some level, sees the empty nature of all things or of the mind, one has to consider the following, namely, who or what sees emptiness, who or what knows that empty nature. And that's where so-called luminous or enlightening mind is explained as the factor which knows the empty nature of all phenomena. Dadi tongyi rangshin tongning yimpa dela salve shepa mena teni shekin minuwa tendi
Shinkin mindu sungyat.
Yeah, so the crucial point here is you have the nature or very essence of things being their absence of a real reality. Now, in order to realize the absence of a real reality, you need knowledge, enlightening knowledge. Enlightening in that this knowledge sees the truth. Otherwise, who will or what will know emptiness? Kanrisna emptiness kurang kanyang me pasong shi kogo re kande shugore.
Tan dikta emptiness de then kanyang me bachi lo gondro ve nyenga shiuji yosa de tar tu ba de emptiness se me bar gasam de resena then digme do song.
So, by way of asserting enlightening knowledge of emptiness, it becomes clear that emptiness is not a mere nothingness, a vacant state of sorts. Like an empty room.
The Shinta Chimbuning
Kandisna Shepatang Ngovoni Dani Omarava in a Jeremy Pay Sultu Nangi Orava.
Yeah.
So what you have is enlightening knowledge, seeing the absence of a real reality, emptiness, so-called emptiness. The two do not exist in separation of one another. The two are in fact inseparable. Therefore, the true nature, emptiness, empty in the sense that it refers to an absence of a real reality, is not about a mere nothingness,
Tiyindu lakung yang takpachi gambala Shinta Chembo
Yang da gompala.
Shinta Chembo Lodrö Thaye Shinta Chembo Papa Tome Ninki Gompa Kari Nimbe Ngedon Tsalman Ronan Songat Jamgök
Nietzsche.
Nietzsche Tsalgore
Now, therefore, Jamgön Kongtrül Lodrö Thaye says, when you're looking to attain a realization of the perfect view, as it were, in the context of, or by way of, vipassana meditation, for the practice to work so that a proper realization is attained, you need to rely upon the teachings set forth in the tradition originating with Nagarjuna, as well as the teachings of the tradition originating with Asanga. You need to know both, or the teachings of both traditions. Also?
Toma Nito Tawan Namda Salwate Shindu Kechembore.
So it's exceedingly important that a practitioner from the very beginning acquires a good knowledge of the flawless view, the view which is to be the basis for his meditation, for his vipassana meditation.
Cheta Tawa La Pen Tombo Lobjong Che Tene Partu Lobjong Che Jab Tawate Takar Segindo Tene Yang do Samna Tanyata Hajang Keshambu Insare.
So it's very important to engage in studies of the scriptures that set forth the flawless viewpoint, and here that concerns primarily the tradition of Nagarjuna as well as the tradition of Asanga. Once extensive studies have been done, one then needs to make sure that the understanding one has acquired in dependence upon one's studies is flawless. Therefore, one looks for the very meaning of those teachings. And one can do so by way of, in one's mind, asking oneself the question, well, what would the crucial point or the key point be in the context of those teachings, and so on and so forth. So one applies oneself to a process of, so to speak, certifying that the understanding one acquired through studies isn't mistaken.
Penna Lobjong Cheju Lechang Kechewati Lobjong Cheja Between La Some Tang that round the touch of Nepach Gobi.
So it's absolutely necessary that one arrives at a definitive knowledge of the teachings that one has studied, without having a definitive knowledge where one is certain that one has properly understood what one studied, progress is not possible.
조금 제거래 조금 제도 로정시라 거마래 돈도 신kin지 용거야. 디원낸 조금 세대 가능성이 하마.
Now there are quite a few individuals who have the opinion that in terms of meditation practice, what is needed is simply to make efforts by way of which one, in one way or another, according to the meditation instructions given, rests in the meditative state that has been taught to one. You have two types of meditation, two basic types of meditation: analytic meditation and so-called resting meditation. And there are many who take the view that analytic meditation is superficial, not needed, and so on and so forth. What one should do is just to focus on so-called resting meditation. 조금
생겼대 또 땡긴 속에 깨빠 막그 소리 송거도와 가시게 된 노래
there is then the mistaken view that in fact a meditator does not need to do anything beyond resting meditation, meaning analysis and a process of learning and so on regarding the teachings is superfluous. There are many who take this view, and Khenpo Rinpoche says, in his view, these people are mistaken.
Perna, 알아서 가지고 티이솔시다. gambo beson ai mejo doje ta karma kontin narim ki son yoba changma simju chinanda tenchu gen nang la thongma ni ne sem chorbe menga de nenten sen song gdo.
Now, in terms of the Kagyu school, and its masters of old, you have, for example, one of the founding fathers, Gambopa, and then you have all the Karmapas, and so on and so forth. All of them emphasized the importance of a set of instructions that are known as searching for the mind.
따와로 푸다 마셔 파르도 셈치 주군도야.
And by way of these instructions, the practitioner is able to do away with mistaken conclusions, false ideas, and the like as to the mind and its workings.
다대지 체네 셈랑인 게 동이 임바당 셈징 오드 동이 임바당 랑신 설 임바당 녜바지. 오케이.
근데
셈 오동바 셈 오동바당 랑신 설 임발라 녜바 땡 축바질래소나
By way of these instructions, it's made possible for the practitioner to sort of begin with figure out the fact that the mind stream is basically about two perspectives. It's about what the mind stream is essentially, namely that the mind stream is empty of a real reality, as well as that there is this working of naturally present knowledge which knows the absence of a real reality, so-called enlightening knowledge, which sees or knows emptiness, the absence of a real reality. So this natural knowledge, naturally occurring or present or spontaneously present knowledge, sees its own empty nature, as it were. So by way of the instructions referred to earlier, therefore, the practitioner is able to arrive at certainty with respect to what the mind stream is or isn't. So a definitive view of it can be acquired. So when one searches for the mind, how is that done? Well, one should understand that these instructions are very much, or their purpose is very much that of giving practitioners who do not have a great aptitude for studies and contemplation to intellectually and to begin with, and then on a more profound level, arrive at the knowledge of how the mind functions in general and in particular as to its true nature. Practitioners who would find it difficult, perhaps, to engage in the studies of the tradition called the Madhyamaka school of thought, in that this involves a great deal of philosophical speculation to be given thought to, as well as quite complex ways of reasoning in order to arrive at a true knowledge of, for example, emptiness. Those studies may be beyond certain individuals, and for their sake, masters of old created this set of instructions, practical instructions, as a substitute for those studied, for those who would find it difficult and maybe not succeed in their studies otherwise.
Penna Trumta Tandre Getcha the Paya Namjung around Genetang Rawuchi getting water Nangdoa, Taiwan water.
So the viewpoint made clear by way of this set of instructions is very much phrased in the shape and form of everyday language, which is easy for those who do not have an aptitude for complex studies.
So
there are many ways in which the same is pointed out to this group of practitioners, namely the proper view or the authentic view. And instructions are continually given until the spiritual master, it becomes clear to the spiritual master that the practitioner in question has actually grasped and understood the crucial points to be understood or known.
And
then, as the practitioner now has achieved definitive knowledge of the authentic view, he is then set to foster that view, to cultivate that view in his meditation practice. And once the authentic view has been acquired, instructions with the aim to point out mind's true nature to the practitioner in terms of analysis and so on, by way of searching for the mind, are no longer necessary. Once the authentic view has been achieved, then the practitioner can properly meditate and is set to do so. He no longer needs to make use of the previous instructions. They have served their purpose. So the instruction then is to rest in the mindset which knows, the mindset based in the authentic view, and therefore knows the true nature to some extent. And that's where so-called resting meditation comes in. And at this point, there is no longer need for any type of analysis. Because the practitioner, presumably, or the practitioner at this point knows the proper view. And this is the process of fostering or cultivating that proper view, is what is known as resting meditation. Chi sungin no titi.
Nga ge tha che song son na yang.
O korang da de norne. Ta che yin trenche ne.
Ding ta dan da tha che ba che, tha che de ye ba che ro wa.
Mare Khenpo. Tingi chi sungin no nyam su lempa po ra.
Okay.
Korang ta che ne.
Me lama
Geve shenyen gi da chirang tawa shedu.
Song na yang.
Ngola.
Song na yang ge shen.
Sung na yang.
Song na yang. Te song se ge me te dan da so su che ro wa.
Re.
So su che re ti lo len jo wan ro ge che pa yang tang gu re song re. Che gam pa so ke.
Kanina ngani ta kukpa chayo sare.
Ta chara jo gam ge sam tang ta chu re.
Me geve shenen gi da chirang ta chepe tawa de re de du sung na yang tene
Song na yang.
tene de du geve shenen gi da che di gongo gendu
Song.
kanang go gerwa
Ya gam se. Ta gam de ba kap la. Yang tokpa min ra shar ge wa.
ore so gerwa
So che wa. Ta ga na sing ge re ji dong de la long chon a sam ji ta che ge wa.
ya
Te du ta wa ke phe ma song wa.
ore
Te song sang yang ne yang do ta wa la che ba tang ge phe na. Nge pa de che ro ge. Den ta wa da to
me
ka.
tawa de to de du tene chepa tangu mare sung sung
Den jogam
Datanda.
ba. Jogam ba ke.
re in geve shenyen da chirang ta chepe nge pa de nye du kana ne tene koran nyam su lempa po de ta de dendre mare da geve shenyen nor de re kare
Ta den de ran da thing ma ro wa. Te ta tong so su che lo song za. Ta wa lo pu ta che ta tong ye ban rong tu byo ma re so re. Ta yu sho ten ta.
mare da de shegure ngani pe chi stuck chayo sar
Ben nge pe ji ya ro wa. Che la chanan ta we ta wa de la me ta sem se de re se ngo che che ro wa. Ta la ma le ya shu. La me te ga ran re gam sho a so na chanan ge gam ro wa. Gam de be ka la chu lo gam ken gam be lo de ga re se na so su che lo ro wa. Ka re nam ton ramen ge ke che gre. Ka re jikta ra bu chen ke che de. Ta ve chi de la lep tu ma re so.
da digging on larava ta di ngeshe tobne tene tawa di gong yare ma to chepa cheju min du sung sung
Song song a.
tanda lame gi ngeshe tob du di na yang
Tan din che gam pa so ge song tong se ge ro wa. Che gam don jo gam ni yo ro wa.
ya
Ta yi de jo gam ka ro wa.
ya tanda che gong gi kap
Ya.
ore che gong gi kap so gi da karina mina geve shenen ji da tanda yapu cha de du chiran ko de du da de sem tong song digging e pagi kechamare
Ta charang ge sem hanam she de dos.
ya
Da che-
halam
Ta che ya por he sha song de sem cha sang thong na yang de khatu re ma to de le kam tu yo ma ro. Kam ko gro wa.
re ti na ngarang gyur tan samro tango gerwa ka re sena nge ma de da cherang tawe nge pan ye du kana ne tene che gom che ge mare song song a go ge mare song song a
Din jo gam be lu ro wa.
re de jogong ge log re te tanda che gong ge kapso lama de den de sung na da cherang ko de du chikpa mare ve
Ya, che ta chik pa su ro wa de yin na ya korang ge ta la me chorang ko den du se ta wa de song. Ta nge gam bu ka la. yang jin bo de che yong de
det korang ngepa de nyeyo mare.
nye ma de
Okay, da den dishik song na tene da ke par shi jong gera man de ma to pe kyan sa bore gin. So then we have the process of analysis, where the practitioner, guided by the spiritual friend, engages in the instructions, by way of which, or the goal of which is to arrive at a definitive knowledge of mind's true nature. Definitive, the word or adjective definitive, pointing to that there remain no doubts in the mind of the practitioner. That practitioner, and therefore the practitioner, would not, when attempting to meditate on mind's true nature, have thoughts of, oh, well, the perspective was supposed to be like that, but meaning this type of practitioner who has arrived at this crossroads, as it were, is now stable in his definitive knowledge. Mental fabrications of one kind or another that would sow doubts in his mind are no longer an issue. So it's a practitioner who has come very far, as it were. And that practitioner then simply does resting meditation, as was said. Then you have the kind of practitioner who has come some way here by relying upon a qualified spiritual friend who guides him through the process of analysis. And the practitioner makes progress. And the spiritual guide may inform him, because the relationship in terms of this kind of teaching situation is, the format is that the instructions are given, they are then used by the practitioner, who then, when some effect of the practice has happened, goes back to the spiritual guide and reports about his perceived progress, and perhaps the spiritual friend will on occasions tell the student that, well, you've got the idea. However, this is not a practitioner who has achieved the same level of stability that the previous practitioner did, who now only does resting meditation. Here the process is still at hand, and therefore, even though the understanding the practitioner has arrived at in terms of mind's true nature is not mistaken, which he has been told by the spiritual guide, this doesn't mean that now, therefore, he can do just resting meditation, because this person is still in the process, hasn't come to the end of the process. Therefore, this person is a regular worldly person, and a regular worldly person who makes efforts on the path will have thoughts of this and that. Thoughts of this and that will surface regarding mind's true nature and otherwise, probably. And therefore, the practitioner of this level is subject to disturbances in terms of thought processes, in terms of fears, and so on and so forth, that are obstacles in terms of his practice. The practice becomes interrupted, perhaps by sudden fear, because the practitioner thought he met with or saw a fear-inspiring non-human being, for example. Whether he did or not is another question, but this sort of thing may happen in terms of practitioners who take their practice seriously and perhaps practice in seclusion, and because of their efforts there will be disturbances or hindrances or obstacles, however one wants to phrase it, happening. And he's sort of caught off guard. So one really has to understand the level of progress a person who does just resting meditation has achieved by way of the spiritual guide guiding him, and the various levels of progress that are made in terms of the previous type of meditation, which is one of analytical meditation, and the possible pitfalls and disturbances that may arise in that context. Because the practitioner of the first level, where analysis is the main focus, is not yet that familiar with mind's true nature. His knowledge, therefore, isn't stable, whereas the practitioner who was advised by his spiritual guide to go on with resting meditation alone is a practitioner who is familiar with mind's true nature to the point where he won't be swayed by disturbances even though they were to occur. So you have to understand this difference.
제가 양송수의 길은 된난 것도 구슬이
Pernara nedi shuyin dangpo nge pa dronken terva pena dredra chitnang na yang digipar cheche mare kan resna korang semginelo gi shetse de tenta chön ende barche som ji rege mare digi kepa
야 된대기 제발시라 욕으로 와
tene chegom nanken terva koran de kas temporeza yo marva semginelo la kom de kas yo marva tene chik resom ramina tene de barchela sopa regerava
제장
digi kepa ergo
되게 제발 탐문 주는 것도 와. 다 제발 진데 용게요, 와.
아하. 야게는 노르나.
노르다 쯤면도 돼. 제금 받던 저로 와. 다그 구슬로인 조감 송거도 왔잖아. 조감 받던 저라.
다 체금 받고랑.
제금 받던 저라이나 밴드다이 제금 송거도 와. 다 캐받던 저이나 뺏을 받들 양네 양도 선나시 땅 돼 직반은 예반 정타 쳐나 된거 보카르 통나야 라진지 통바임 받다 참함에 샘도 샤르도 구요래 제발
직바 제타쳐나
제타쳐 텐데지 마중 파도 제바도 고그를 가란 요야 팽가 말해서 구요래
So
this
is one perspective, the extent of how familiar or not familiar the practitioner is with mind's true nature, making for various levels of stability. Another perspective is the following. Khenpo Rinpoche goes back to analytic meditation practice, where the practitioner is someone who engages in studies and contemplation of the teachings of the great traditions of Nagarjuna, Asanga, and so on. And as was mentioned, that would involve complex processes of reasoning, by way of which the empty nature of all phenomena is known to some extent. Now, the focus here on the part of the practitioner is such that, in consequence of extensive and complex processes of reasoning, it becomes quite clear to the practitioner that all things are empty of a real reality. So one shouldn't understand analytic meditation one shouldn't mistakenly think that analytic meditation is about formal studies all the time. Of course, it begins with formal studies, but once you're familiar with the contents of the scriptures, then you would go on using the contents mentally simply, because you're very familiar with the material. You no longer need the text there and read what the text says and then give thought to what the text says. You're so familiar with the material that you can do without the written word at this point. And here the result, Khenpo Rinpoche explains, is achieved in the case of some practitioners, that emptiness, the emptiness of all things, or emptiness as the true nature of all things, is understood and seen clearly in consequence of these more complex and to some extent at the beginning intellectual exercises. And thus some level of certainty can be achieved. In brief, now, the goal is the same for practitioners of both methods, analytical meditation and resting meditation. What one wants to achieve is what one wants to achieve is the worldly view which presumes that all things are real. This is what one wants to overcome by using either of these two approaches. So this doesn't mean that one wants all manifestations to stop and not exist anymore. This is not what emptiness is about. It's about one's perception of all appearances. The worldly presumption that each and everything is real. This is what one wants to overcome. One doesn't want the thing to evaporate into nothing. That's not the point at all. So, in order to understand so-called emptiness, one needs the authentic view, the view which knows that emptiness is not about a mere nothingness, a vacuum of sorts. It's about an absence of a real reality in whatever we see here and so on. So that's all for today.
So namdaye tamje zegwanye tamne yebe ranam pamje yegana je balabtuwa sigbe sole rowa sho. Why?